In 1823, in the heart of the unexplored lands of the central United States, a man named Hugh Glass would face a cruel fate and make history by surviving where few would endure. Born at the end of the 18th century, Hugh Glass was an experienced fur trapper, known for his ability to survive in any wild environment. At that time, the American West was still a mystery to many colonists, inhabited by indigenous tribes and filled with natural dangers. He was part of an expedition organized by the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, one of the most important fur trade companies in North America. The journey began at Fort Kiowa, on the Missouri River, in August of that year, with the goal of reaching distant rivers in search of valuable animals such as beavers. Among the members of the expedition were John Fitzgerald, a young soldier, and Jim Bridger, an inexperienced teenager who would play crucial roles in the events to come. The mission required courage, physical endurance, and deep respect for the unknown, as the men walked through hostile territories without accurate maps or secure communication. The region crossed by the hunters included dense forests, mountains cut by icy winds, and turbulent rivers, a scenario worthy of legends. But not even all the experience accumulated until then could prepare Hugh Glass for what was about to happen. During a solitary exploration, while looking for firewood and food for the camp, he encountered something that would change his life forever. While walking near the Grand River, in territory that today belongs to the state of South Dakota, Hugh spotted a shadow among the trees. It was a grizzly bear, a female and furious, protecting her cubs, a fatal encounter that would be remembered for generations. Before he had time to react, the animal attacked with tremendous force, throwing him to the ground and tearing parts of his body away. Hugh was slashed by sharp claws, had his flesh torn open, and nearly lost the use of one arm completely. He was bleeding heavily, and his life hung by a thread. His screams of pain echoed through the woods, alerting his companions, who ran to help him, but nothing could erase what had been done. When the members of the expedition arrived at the place where Hugh Glass had been attacked, they found a desolate scene. Blood scattered on the ground, claw marks in the dirt, and the mutilated body of a man barely breathing. The grizzly bear, still angry, tried to attack again, but was shot down quickly by the men, who saved their own lives before even thinking about the injured man. Hugh was unconscious, with serious injuries to his face, neck, and arms. He had lost a lot of blood and seemed to have no strength left to resist. The men did what they could with the limited resources they had. They cleaned the wounds as best they could, improvised bandages with torn cloth, and tried to give him water to keep him hydrated. John Fitzgerald, the more experienced soldier, thought Hugh was already doomed and that carrying his body would only be an unnecessary burden on the journey. Jim Bridger, the young apprentice, hesitated to leave a man to die without fighting for him, but also knew the group needed to move forward to survive. After a brief discussion, the leader of the expedition decided that some men would stay with Glass until the end, while others continued the journey safely. However, faced with the imminent threat of attacks from Native Americans of the Arikara tribe, who had been chasing the hunters, the decision changed dramatically. In a rush and fear, the team decided to abandon Hugh Glass right there, leaving him alone without weapons, food, or any real chance of survival. To make matters worse, they took his belongings with them, including his gun, the only tool that could guarantee some defense against animals or human enemies. Even seriously injured, Hugh woke up hours later, aware that he had been betrayed, and understood that only he himself could get him out of that deadly forest. Unable to speak properly due to injuries to his throat, and dragging himself with difficulty, he began to move, centimeter by centimeter, in search of help. Each movement was a battle against pain and exhaustion, but something inside him, perhaps the instinct for survival, perhaps a thirst for justice, kept him alive. He spent days like this, feeding on roots, plants, and meat from dead animals, drinking water from streams, and sleeping outdoors under the open sky. His body bled constantly, infections started to appear, and death seemed inevitable. But Hugh Glass had other ideas. While his companions followed the river downstream toward Fort Kiowa, hoping to escape from the indigenous hostility and return alive, Hugh Glass crawled, dragged himself, and fought against nature and his own body. He used hot stones to close deep cuts and applied medicinal herbs learned from Native Americans during years of coexistence with local tribes. For days, he covered incredible distances considering his condition. About 200 miles, crossing mountains, dense forests, and icy plains, always heading toward the Cheyenne River. At one point, he had to swim in icy waters to cross a river, carrying only a wet blanket and using branches to balance himself in the currents. Without tools, he built a rough raft with logs and vines to cross another stretch of the Grand River, avoiding being swept away by the force of the water. Along the way, he faced hungry wolves that smelled his scent of blood and rotting flesh, having to sleep with his eyes half open and his heart racing. One night, while resting under a tree, he felt the strong smell of a nearby animal and, upon opening his eyes, found two hungry wolves staring directly at him. Using a thick stick and shouting as much as he could, he frightened the animals and drove them away, but he knew he couldn't trust any moment of peace. He traveled by day and hid at night, using the sun as a guide and observing the behavior of birds and animals to find sources of water. As he advanced, his body slowly healed, but the physical pain was accompanied by another pain, the pain of betrayal by his companions. With every step taken, he silently swore that he would find those who had abandoned him and make justice with his own hands, if necessary. In the border area between South Dakota and Montana, he encountered a tribe of Lakota Indians, who received him cautiously but helped him with natural remedies and food. Thanks to the knowledge acquired over years of living among different cultures, Hugh managed to communicate with gestures and show his gratitude. After spending days with the tribe, he regained part of his strength and continued his journey, now with a clear objective: reach the Yellowstone River and find any sign of the lost expedition. It was the beginning of September and the cold increased each night, but nothing seemed capable of stopping the man who had risen from the ashes of death. After weeks of wandering through the wilderness, Hugh Glass finally reached the banks of the Yellowstone River, where he knew the expedition would likely be passing. There, he met French traders who recognized his pitiful condition and offered him food and protection, as well as listened to his story with disbelief. The traders told him that the original expedition had survived the attack by the Iroquois and was reorganizing in a nearby camp, preparing to return to Fort Kiowa. Glass learned, then, that Fitzgerald and Bridger were still alive, and that the chance of justice still existed although time was against him. With the help of the traders, he obtained a horse and set off in search of the camp of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, determined to end that saga. When he finally arrived at the location, he was received with shock and amazement. Everyone believed he had been dead for a long time. His body still showed deep scars from the bear attack, but his eyes shone with the certainty of someone who had defeated the impossible. Upon seeing Fitzgerald, Hugh said not a word. He simply stared at him with a mixture of hatred and calmness, as if he had already decided his fate. Bridger, on the other hand, approached trembling, asking for forgiveness and saying he was forced to leave him, fearing for his own life. Fitzgerald, more arrogant, tried to justify his actions by saying that Glass's death seemed certain and that he didn't want to risk the entire group for someone who wouldn't survive. Hugh, despite saying very little, took his weapon back and demanded that the men answer before the leader of the expedition for what they had done. The leader, surprised by Glass's survival, listened to the testimonies and decided to punish both men. Fitzgerald was fined and Bridger forgiven for being young and inexperienced. But for Hugh, that wasn't justice. It was just a symbolic punishment that didn't erase what he had suffered alone in the wilderness. Despite this, he did not resort to violence and kept his word. "Vengeance is a choice of God," he said, putting his weapon away and turning his back. Thus, Hugh Glass concluded one of the most impressive stories of the American frontier, becoming a living myth among fur trappers and traders of the time. Hugh Glass lived for several more years after his miraculous survival, though details of his life remain sparse. What is known is that he continued working as a guide and trapper, often venturing into dangerous territories where few dared to go. His reputation as a man of resilience and resourcefulness grew steadily, and he became a figure of admiration among fellow frontiersmen. He was respected not only for his physical endurance but also for his deep understanding of the land and its creatures. Many sought his advice when planning expeditions, knowing that his experience in the wilderness was unmatched. He often spoke of the importance of preparation, patience, and respect for nature, lessons he had learned the hard way. Despite the hardships he endured, Hugh never lost his sense of purpose or his love for the wild. He remained a solitary figure, preferring the silence of the forests to the noise of growing settlements. Over time, he became more cautious, more reflective, and perhaps wiser. Yet, he never stopped exploring, never stopped moving forward. His name continued to echo in the camps and trading posts along the Missouri River, passed on by those who had heard his story firsthand. Some described him as a quiet man, others as a man of few words but deep convictions. Either way, those who met him never forgot him. His presence was enough to command attention, not because of his size or voice, but because of the aura of someone who had stared death in the face and returned. By the early 1830s, Hugh had become somewhat of a legend, a symbol of the untamed spirit of the frontier. He was the kind of man people whispered about around campfires, the kind of man whose name was spoken with reverence and awe. And yet, despite all the fame and recognition, he remained humble, choosing to live simply and quietly. But fate had one last chapter in store for him, a tragic end that would complete the circle of his extraordinary life. It was in 1833 that Hugh Glass met his final fate. While traveling along the Yellowstone River, he was attacked by a group of Arikara warriors. The reason for the attack remains uncertain, but many believe he was mistaken for another white hunter who had killed a tribal leader earlier. Unlike the previous encounter, there was no negotiation, no chance for dialogue. He was killed on the spot with no opportunity for defense or escape. His body was buried hastily, without a marker or precise record, lost among the trees and mountains he so deeply loved. For many, this was the poetic conclusion of a life marked by nature, violence, and redemption. Hugh Glass lived as a free man, died as a stranger, and was remembered as a myth. His journey symbolized the end of an era in which men like him wandered freely through the wilderness, guided only by instinct and necessity. Shortly after his death, the American government began implementing more aggressive colonization policies, radically changing the map of the frontiers and ending the lifestyle of independent trappers. The remote outposts were replaced by larger towns, the rivers were mapped, and the animals, such as beavers, began to disappear due to excessive hunting. The story of Hugh became a reflection of a time that would never return, the time of uncharted trails, wolf encounters, and men who walked alone. Even without a tomb or honors, his name echoes to this day in the pages of American history as that of a man who defied death, and almost won. After his return to civilization, the story of Hugh Glass began to spread rapidly among fur trappers, traders, and even among the colonists living in the most remote parts of the United States. Many initially doubted the truthfulness of his journey. How could a wounded man survive so many days alone, without food, water, or weapons, in such hostile territory? But the visible wounds on his body, his deep scars, and the testimony of French traders who had helped him gave credibility to his version of events. His account was recorded in personal diaries of other members of the expedition, and within months, it became one of the most talked about stories in the world of American frontiersmen. The local press, still in its infancy at the time, began publishing short articles about his feat, praising not only his physical endurance but also his mental and spiritual strength. Writers and historians of the frontier began including Glass's story in chronicles about the dangers faced by pioneers exploring the American West. Some called him hero, others silent avenger, but all agreed. He was an extreme example of human resilience in the face of adversity. Even after leaving the service of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, Hugh continued to live on the edges of civilization, preferring the natural environment to crowded cities and social conflicts. He spent some time working as a guide for new expeditions, sharing his knowledge of trails, animals, and survival in inhospitable environments. His reputation grew even more, and many young men who wanted to become hunters or explorers saw him as an inspiring and almost mythical figure. Despite overcoming much of his physical injuries, the psychological scars of abandonment never fully disappeared. He kept with him the constant memory of Fitzgerald and Bridger, and although he chose not to seek personal revenge, he carried with pride the certainty that he had proven he could survive where no one believed. As the years passed, Hugh became a symbol of the American frontier spirit, one who faced the unknown with courage, determination, and faith. Over time, his story served as inspiration for future books, tales, and even urban legends that mix truth and fantasy. And so, Hugh Glass, the man who survived the grizzly bear attack and walked hundreds of miles through hostile lands, entered history as one of the greatest survivors of the American frontier. As the years went by, the story of Hugh Glass was retold in different ways, gaining dramatic and even mystical elements that distorted some original facts. In some versions, it was said that he had fought the bear with bare hands. In others, that he had been saved by forest spirits or by an Indian who guided him in dreams. These adaptations, although not always faithful to reality, helped keep his memory alive in popular culture and in oral historical records from the frontier. Books by hunters and writers of the 19th century began to include parts of his journey in collections of heroic tales, turning him into an almost legendary character. Local newspapers of the time wrote about him as if he were a semi-divine figure, capable of enduring any storm and emerging unharmed, or at least alive. Children growing up in villages near the Missouri River heard stories about him as if he were a hero of modern times, someone who had faced death and won. Many indigenous tribes, especially the Lakotas, spoke of him with respect, remembering how he had asked for help through gestures and looks, and how he had accepted their herbal remedies with gratitude. To the natives, Hugh represented something rare. A white man who understood the land, respected its limits, and knew how to coexist with the wild world without trying to dominate it. Many of the accounts that emerged later were based on imprecise memories, as Hugh never wrote his own story, leaving it only in oral testimony. This led to various interpretations about his personality, motivations, and even the real events of his solitary journey. Some portrayed him as a cold and vengeful man, others as a wise man of the jungle, capable of reading nature's signs with supernatural precision. Regardless of variations, the central essence remained. A man abandoned to die came back to demand justice with his own feet. What began as a tragic and brutal episode turned into something greater, a metaphor for man's struggle against nature, fear, and abandonment. Hugh Glass was not just a survivor. He was a symbol of everything it meant to live on the edge of the impossible. In the years following his triumphant return, Hugh Glass decided to leave the fur trade behind and sought a quieter life along the banks of the Missouri River. He settled near Fort Kiowa, where he found work as a mercenary and guide for small caravans seeking to cross dangerous regions. Although fame followed him, he avoided talking much about the bear attack or Fitzgerald and Bridger, as if he wanted to leave the past behind. However, in 1833, a new tragedy would abruptly interrupt his quiet life. During a trip down the Yellowstone River, Hugh was attacked by a group of Arikara Indians. Unlike last time, there was no negotiation, no chance of dialogue. He was killed right there, with no chance of defense or escape. The reason for the attack remains uncertain, but many believe he was mistaken for another white hunter who had previously killed a tribal leader. His body was buried simply, without a headstone or precise record, lost among the trees and mountains he loved so much. For many, this was the poetic conclusion of a life marked by nature, violence, and redemption. Hugh Glass lived as a free man, died as a stranger, and was remembered as a myth. His journey symbolized the end of an era in which men like him wandered freely through the wilderness, guided only by instinct and necessity. Shortly after his death, the American government began implementing more aggressive colonization policies, radically changing the map of the frontiers and ending the lifestyle of independent trappers. The remote outposts were replaced by larger towns, the rivers were mapped, and the animals, such as beavers, began to disappear due to excessive hunting. The story of Hugh became a reflection of a time that would never return, the time of uncharted trails, wolf encounters, and men who walked alone. Even without a tomb or honors, his name echoes to this day in the pages of American history as that of a man who defied death and almost won. Although he died without direct descendants, the legacy of Hugh Glass crossed generations thanks to the cultural impact of his story. By the end of the 19th century, His name appeared in several historical chronicles and compilations about the lives of fur trappers in the Old West. In 1953, the first official film adaptation of his story hit the screens with the movie The Great Frontier, starring George Montgomery. Years later, in 1971, filmmaker Richard C. Sarafian brought the audience the film Man in the Wilderness, starring Richard Harris in the leading role, directly inspired by Glass's journey. That production once again brought to light the debate about morality, loyalty, and the cost of survival under extreme conditions. But it was in 2015 that Hugh Glass reached global recognition with the film The Revenant, directed by Alejandro González Iñárritu and starring Leonardo DiCaprio. The film, despite taking creative liberties with the original story, brought the incredible real saga of Hugh Glass to light and earned DiCaprio his first Oscar for Best Actor. From then on, the real story of Glass was revisited by historians, documentarians, and YouTubers specializing in American history. Books, podcast series, documentaries, and even survival games began to reference his journey as a reference of human resilience. Academics began studying his story from multiple perspectives: anthropological, historical, philosophical, and even medical, analyzing how his body managed to survive the injuries. Additionally, his relationship with indigenous peoples was re-examined, highlighting how he learned from them and respected their healing and survival practices. Hugh became a cross-cutting figure, discussed in classrooms, film festivals, and even lectures on crisis management and leadership in extreme situations. His story is frequently used as an example in psychology courses, showing how the human mind can overcome physical and emotional trauma. Many military and survival training programs cite the journey of Glass as a practical case of how determination can overcome even the most adverse circumstances. Thus, even centuries after his lonely journey through the wilderness, Hugh Glass continues to inspire millions around the world with his incredible story of survival, courage, and vengeance. The story of Hugh Glass is not just an epic narrative of survival. It contains valuable lessons in resilience, determination, and self-overcoming. He shows us that even when everything seems lost, the human being has within an almost inexhaustible strength to continue fighting. His journey is proof that the mind can be as important as the body when facing a limiting situation. Often, it wasn't physical strength that kept him alive, but rather the conscious decision not to give up, to keep moving forward, even inch by inch. He teaches that hope can exist even in the midst of absolute despair, and that the simple idea of a better future can sustain a wounded man for miles. Furthermore, Hugh illustrates the power of adaptation. He didn't have food, so he ate roots. He didn't have medicine, so he used herbs. He didn't have a weapon, but he survived with intelligence and instinct. His story also makes us reflect on the importance of loyalty and trust between people sharing a difficult journey. The abandonment he suffered serves as a warning about how decisions made out of fear or selfishness can have lasting consequences, both for those who commit them and for those who suffer them. But perhaps the greatest lesson from Hugh Glass is that of contained revenge. Even though he had real reasons to kill Fitzgerald, he chose to forgive and move on. This gesture demonstrates maturity, emotional control, and a deep understanding of what truly matters in life: surviving and learning from experiences. His journey invites us to think about how we deal with our own challenges, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual. How many times do we give up on something because we think we won't succeed? How many times do we let fear speak louder than our will to win? Hugh Glass shows us that even without resources, without support, and without guarantees, we can go beyond what we thought possible. He was a man of his time, but his story transcends eras and continues to live not only for its historical value, but for its universal message. And now, you, who have watched this incredible story, will you allow the daily challenges to stop you? Or will you use this inspiration to keep going, no matter what happens? If you like this real story of courage and survival, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to receive all the updates about fascinating stories from the past. Leave your comment below telling us which real story has impressed you the most so far. And if you want to learn more about Hugh Glass and his epic journey, click here in the description links. See you in the next video.